Hello everybody, thank you for all coming this afternoon to the third in our series of panels looking at performance in APT8. My name's Ruth McDougall and I'm the Curator of Pacific Art here at the gallery, so was part of the team that worked on this exhibition. I'd like to acknowledge the land on which we meet and the Indigenous people, both past and present, who have cared for it. I pay tribute to their continued resilience and creativity, to the strength of their culture and the richness that it brings to this place. I think that as we begin a conversation about performance today, it's important to acknowledge that this land has been danced on for centuries, and that these dances have been and are often still a deeply felt communion between people living an ancestral and place. As we talk about ideas like performance art here on this land and in relation to the contemporary cultures of Australia, Asia and the Pacific, we need to acknowledge that many of the practices that we place under the heading of performance and art today exceed those terms. I'm thinking of the singing in of Gumbi Ganambar's work as part of the opening weekend celebrations for APT, of the whakawatia of Rosanna Raymond Savage's and Indigenous spokesman Mark Yetting Paulson took us through to clear the path for the Savage Club to be a space in which we all can feel safe to be who we are, and the haunting sounds of Teo Massing's conch as he and Siman Wenetham moved the audience into Yumi Danis for the dance that activated that space. All of these performances come from and speak to customary practice and ritual. When we look at the history of performance across this amazing region in which we live, it's embedded in life. It's not separated from other forms of expression. It's not separated from the processes of learning and creation through which it comes into being. It adheres to the values and beliefs of the society who creates it. It proceeds according to protocol, and because of this, performance becomes a space often in which the contested and oppositional can be safely explored. When we look at many traditional forms of theatre, dance and sing-sing, and the circles or clearings in which these occur, they are spaces where balance is created and maintained by inviting in the danger, speaking of it, and then letting it go. Contemporary practitioners across the region continue to draw on this heritage. And today we're very lucky to have gathered with three wonderful panellists: Professor Susan Best, Director of the Fine Arts Program at the Queensland College of Art, independent curator and artist Leuli Eshraghi, and writer, curator and a very dear colleague Julie Ewington, to explore how artists are using the body in performance to explore sexual and gender identity. So one of the artists that I work with quite closely was Julia Magu-Gray. Julia is an artist who we see on the screen at the moment of Australian and Papuan heritage. Julia grew up dancing in her Mekio village, was trained in contemporary dance here in Australia and works with practitioners and styles from across the region. Her APT8 performances are interesting in the context of today's discussion, and I wanted to begin with her because they draw on and speak to the continued conflict between Indigenous understandings and practices and those of settler societies, particularly around women's bodies. In Mekio, just outside of Port Moresby, the capital of PNG, dance or sing-sing happens in a clearing. Women are dressed in bilas or ornamentation that tells those who are watching exactly who they are. The women's lineage is marked on their bodies via full body tattoo. It rests in the ornaments that they carry as well as the movements and songs they perform. Customarily, Mekio women do not fully cover their bodies. They dance bare-breasted, wearing the marks of their ancestors, their grass skirt and necklaces, and they are considered fully dressed in that state. Missionaries who worked in Mekio area in the early 20th century brought with them a culture and attitude towards the body which sought to cover it up. They actively discouraged the practice of women's tattoo to the point where Magu-Gray's mothers and aunties did not receive the marks, and the practice was nearly lost. Moving to Australia, these Papuan women fell even more under the gaze of a culture that saw their bodies and the way that they dressed to dance as dangerous. They were no longer able to participate in those practices. Sadly today, that culture and that gaze is also felt in PNG, and Julia talks quite a lot about the inability of, or the sense of women feeling now that they need to cover up there as well. Julia's APT8 performance, Anisia, was created for her children and those of her friends and sisters. The word Anisia means for the future. The piece centres around a young Motuan Australian, Leuli, who we see here on the left, on the cusp of womanhood, dressed in full bilas, bare-breasted but with what is taboo, covered by multiple necklaces. As she walks through the space of the gallery, Leuli was accompanied by her female elders, all dressed in black, as we can see on the right, singing a lament from the Solomons called Aileki. Standing in the foyer of Goma, beautiful and proud, Leuli was wrapped from foot to head in caution tape. As the older women continued in their lament, Maggie O'Gray's children unwrapped her and led her away. The space of the performance in this work was used as one where what needs to be articulated is spoken. The body is central because as an Indigenous person, the body even today is still a contested site. When Julia talks of this work, it's about acknowledging and honouring the strength of Papuan woman. It's about beauty and strength of her culture and the need to give it spaces in which they are able to be who they are. The space of performance and the space of the performance in APT was one where the conflict could arise and be dealt with and a process of healing begun. Leuli, I know that ideas of an Indigenous resurgence in terms of physical bodies and the bodies of knowledge is an interest of yours, as is the exploration of gender and sexual fluidity. And I'm wondering if you'd like to expand a little bit on those ideas in relation to what you got out of APT.
Yeah, thank you, and thank you for being here. Particularly, I know Julia really well as well, and she is the founder of a dance group, performance group called Tsunameke, and which grouped a whole lot of the community members in Karmalang, Darwin together, as well as the Nesian Pride Festival, which was, until she moved recently to Tamaki Makaurau, Auckland, a really important community festival in that context. I come from Samoan and Persian background, so a different but related cultural context, and the expressions of gender and sexuality and the kind of recovery of what some of us are calling body sovereignty, the recovery of a fuller sense of self, and that's not only in kind of what we wear and how we act, but also in terms of relationships to each other and to non-living and other living things that are not human beings. So particularly in Indigenous worldviews that I'm familiar with, and from the Samoan context particularly, the recovery of relationships and responsibilities to the ecology that you're from, so the mountain Vaya and the river Loimata Apaula in my case, and the kind of the restoration of that water source, where right now it's quite polluted, and some of us are working towards bringing back a healthy shrimp population, which is all kind of part of an Indigenous worldview in that context. Yeah, so I think particularly in the works that Julia made, and also particularly Yuki Kihara, who's a Samoan artist, if you could find the images, thanks, who's kind of one of a kind in our culture. She, and also Benji and Justin, they're incredible as well. Yuki is one of the preeminent Samoan artists. She's of Samoan and Japanese heritage. She is based between Apia in Samoa and Tamaki Makaurau, Auckland, and has used her body as the site of contestation of a whole lot of historical and continuing injustices and kind of questions around post-colonial conditions, the impacts of globalization on workers, and particularly on smaller places such as Samoa and other island groups. So in this series, where do we come from, what are we, where are we going, which it goes after Paul Gauguin's series of the same title from almost 100, I think a bit over 100 years ago. In Tahiti, she has this character based on a personage kind of based on imagery from the Turnbull Library in Wellington of a mixed-race Samoan. And the title simply says half-caste Samoan. It doesn't have a name. This woman is nameless, as is the tradition in many of this, or the convention in a lot of that kind of photography. And in this work, this character, which she then joins with a lot of the biblical influence in Samoa, Salome, is looking at the future, looking at the past, and looking at the present, where these are collapsed in a lot of indigenous worldviews into this kind of ever-present time-space that doesn't have a beginning, middle, and end. And particularly looking at the sites of destruction through successive cyclones in Samoa, and also German colonization, such as the monument up there in Mulinu Peninsula, and also the Mau independence movement on the top left, where under the German colonial period and then under the New Zealand period, a lot of the kind of social organizing and governance of the society were highly regimented, and when people wanted to get towards an independence and their self-government, they were heavily suppressed, and a lot of people were exiled or killed. And I think it's like a surreptitious way, in my opinion, of looking at also the imposition of colonial era sodomy and kind of the forbidden nature of homosexuality and transgender identities under that period, which is exactly where a lot of these attitudes come into Samoan context. So in Samoa we have multiple genders. There's often people will talk about 3 genders, but there are 4 in my understanding. Fa'afine, which is roughly equivalent to a trans woman. Fa'atama, roughly equivalent to a trans man. A cis woman and a cis man. Fa'afine and tama. And everybody has a role in society. Everybody has a role in the family unit and in the village. So it's kind of like you get to be your individual self, but you don't own your body. Your family owns your body. Your ancestors own your body. So it's all kind of part of contributing.
Saying that Yuki Kahara is a trans...
Yeah, so she's a Fa'afafine artist. I kind of wanted to bring that in a bit later.
Oh, sorry. People might not know.
The kind of... Her body is, particularly for a trans person, a political site of contestation of the European influences on Samoan society, the hegemonic kind of the state which decides who is what, and if you are born a certain way, whether you're allowed to identify another way or not. And the Samoan state doesn't necessarily care whether you identify one way or another. The society kind of rules over that in a much kind of deeper way. I think that's probably enough.
Julie, the performances of the Melbourne-based Mangano sisters don't draw on or speak to the Indigenous realm, but do assert a certain lineage of practice. There's this one that links them to the Russian women's theatre group. Would you be able to speak to this and how identity is played out, and also the importance of process as part of their work?
Yes, I'd love to, but I also should acknowledge the presence of Silvana Mangano in the audience and welcome her, because there was a live performance today. So if I get anything wrong, Silvana. I, in a contrarian spirit, wanted to speak particularly about There Is No There, which is the video and the performance work, because I was very struck by the fact that the, I believe, 21 women who appear in different parts of the film appear in these very plain costumes which are drawn from what was originally a Soviet theatre practice. It's called the Blue Blouse Theatre, and they had a series of performative conventions, really. It's an absolutely fascinating story, and it runs from about 1923 to about 1932, and the 1932 date is completely understandable because that's when the Zdanovism cut every kind of avant-garde or experimental practice in the Soviet Union off at the knees, in some cases literally, I think. So there was no more experimental theatre after that, but there were apparently about 5,000 of these groups spread across the USSR, and and thousands of people participated in them, and they were part of this enormous development of agitprop. I mean, they actually worked with the Soviet state, with the infant Soviet state during that period before Stalin became the sole boss of it for the next 20 years. And that was particularly interesting because, as you can see, if you go into the video, which is in the very first gallery 1.1 on that side, you see all of these women making gestures, you know, whether it's this, or the one I love the best is where the woman behind blocks your mouth. So there are all these gestures, and the language of gesture that was in that theatre was very much because in that period, 22 to 32, these theatre groups were appearing to non-literate people. What they were playing about was about contemporary issues, and that's sometimes called living newspaper, right? I think of them as human headlines, which is what John McDougall called Ai Weiwei, but at any rate, living quite correctly, living newspaper. And so here, I think it's really clear. Here's Silvana Mangano and her sister Gabriella Mangano have worked with the initial group and with the dancers from QUT's dance studio to interpret what's happening in newspapers or in current affairs. So I don't think you can be in Australia today and see people not being able to speak or being told not to hear, and seeing the dancers come onto a round thing like this, like a little island, without thinking of the refugee confinement. That was one of my main readings, you know. But then as I watched it through a number of times, I thought one of the great things about this silent language is that you can import a number of readings into the work as you go. Now, what has all this got to do with gender? I was particularly interested, as I said, in the contrarian spirit, because it occurred to me, and I ran this idea past Silvana. I don't think it had occurred to you particularly, but it occurred to me that in this very simple costume, and the blue blouse, of course, because even like today, blue denim is a kind of worker fabric. Just wearing plain blue, it's the most common kind of everyday garment for European workers, Russian workers. Just this plain garment and the trousers and the complete absence of jewellery and the complete absence of any feminine blandishments meant for me what was happening was that women were appearing as universal protagonists. Not as the exception, but as the rule. And I really loved that. So when I asked Silvana Mangano about that, I said, why women? And she said, well, since she and her sister were not appearing as they had in so many works in the videos, the most natural thing seemed to be to... I just had to ask the question, you know. And the most natural thing seemed to be to replace their presence with those of various women. And I thought that was really great, because normally you expect to see women as the exception, not the rule. But of course, increasingly, I think we women are emboldened to see women as the rule rather than the exception. And that is a big change in terms of how to think about people in the world. So I enjoy the work enormously. I did notice one person. There's one wonderful woman in it. Her name is Tiffany Parbs. She's a jeweller and she works with gesture. She's quite something, and I know her work from another context. So I was curious to know who the people were. They're not professional dancers, they're not professional actors. It just happens that one of them is a person working in jewellery. And Silvana said to me they wanted to have a range of ages and non-professional origins. So that's how it happens. But it's, I think, very, very interesting. And as I said, you will, as you see, there'll be one more performance on, is it the 20th of April, the 10th of April is the last day. There'll be one more performance on the 10th, and I imagine there may be different gestures, I don't know, but the same? The same. But you can, what will happen is that your thinking about what you've seen in the topical newspapers will be stimulated, and it will help to focus you on that again. I think it's very valuable in that way. But as I said, for me, the fact that gender is not, you know, or sexuality or sex is not, you know, there's no sense of that particularly. That is, for me, the great value of the work, in a way.
So interesting, the idea of the uniform having that effect. I hadn't thought of that in relation to this work.
It's a very constructivist uniform. So you become a human unit. What I also enjoy very much is the slight sense of the mechanised that survives from the aesthetics of that period, which which one sees from time to time, and we've just seen recently in Sydney at the Sydney Biennial in a work of Justine Williams. So the strong kind of interest in the machine aesthetic and the sense of people as being cogs in a larger structure survives a little bit, I think, in this. But at any rate, I enjoyed the dialogue between the actions, regimented, simple actions of the dancers, and in the flesh and on the screen. And I think that dialogue is really wonderful.
I think there's something quite beautiful also in the group, sort of the relationships that happen, like that it is a group.
Oh yeah.
That it's not just one person.
No, you get a sense of a collective.
Yes,
in a very strong way.
Which I think is a gender, is something that I certainly associate with women.
With femininity.
Yeah, it's to work together. I also found the use of silence and the importance of body as a tool within that work incredibly compelling.
Yes.
And the idea of process, the importance of process that's brought out through it. And I was wondering, when something is lost or vulnerable, it can be refound often through the strengths of being reperformed. And I was wondering, Julie, whether that is something in Christian Thompson's work in relation to the singing and.
Yes. Well, there's one image that we didn't. I don't think we got the Polari image up, did we?
We have got Polari here.
Have we? There are two works by Christian Thompson just to speak about, and I'll speak about this one first, which is Refuge, because again, I was in a spirit of being contrarian. I love the fact that Christian has appeared so often in various guises wearing different hats, literally, that I like the fact that he appears almost unmade up and very, very simply garbed, and he sings this song. And you can't tell what he's singing because it's in Bidjara language, which is the language of his people from Western Queensland near Barcaldine. But I have seen this work performed in another version. I saw it at the Pitt Rivers where he did the original research, and it's very different. It's sung by a weedy little white bloke who's naked to the waist. I hope he's not a friend of anybody here, the weedy little white bloke. He's a small man who's a professional singer, and he's a beautiful singer, and he sings the song in Bidjara again, but it's subtitled. So you have an access immediately to what the meaning is, and it's absolute rip snorter because it's quite a traditional song, and it's a gay love song. So the white man was singing on the video that I saw in Oxford, and it was saying, "Come with me, my black brother, come to me under the cover of night." It's really, really beautiful. Wow. It's really beautiful. And so this is a version of it again with Christian singing, and he's been learning the language. So it is a wonderful thing, I think, that he's doing. But again, the fact that he presents himself in a nice shirt, really simply, and just straight to camera, I like enormously, because that makes that recuperation part of the current everyday world. I mean, I'd be happy to give him the shirt off my back if I thought he needed it for a video. So that's one important thing. The second thing is, you all will know the images of Christian that are on the front of the building, wearing a sort of a hydrangea on his head. I thought that was a fantastic duality in this exhibition, because there he is made up. He's in whiteface, which is great. He's wearing sort of hats, and he's literally blowing smoke in our faces, right? Which is really great. All you have to do is look at the image. So then I wondered about the title, and Ruth came to my aid, and so did Wikipedia. So Polari is a corruption of parlare. And it's partly Romance or Italian, partly Romany, and it was a slang used in London by sailors, prostitutes, thieves, people in the East End, and it was particularly a gay cant. And a couple of words have survived lots of words have survived into regular English, but the two I picked out are naff and zhush. to my intense delight, because I always thought zhush was onomatopoeic, but no, it's part of this language. And it's, according to our valuable Wikipedia entry, the language has fallen out of use, though of course Christian found it. It's fallen out of use because people didn't need a kind of gay subcultural language after homosexuality was no longer illegal in the UK after 1967. So if any of you remember the comic Kenneth Williams, or Kenneth Horne, in his series Around the Horn, you will know that there were people who kept this alive quite late in the piece, within living memory, but not anymore. But of course, being as he was, doing a PhD at Oxford and only an hour and a half from London by train, Christian was able to find access to these things. So again, a fantastic recuperation of a different language, completely different language, and I think a lovely dialogue in the exhibition.
There's also the London-based LGBTIQ international rights advocacy organisation called Polaris Foundation. So it must come from the same etymology. And
so is it Polaris with an S on the end?
S.
So Polaris.
Yeah. So there's and they kind of do a lot of campaigning in West Africa, Central Africa, around the world.
Great. Okay.
I was just thinking also about in Ming Wong's work, where there's the presence of Tamara Pertamina, who's a trans woman based in Yogyakarta, and from anecdotal kind of stories that friends have told me, that in Yogyakarta and Jakarta itself, there's a gay slang.
I bet.
That is like the vanguard of the Indonesian language. So
yeah.
all the most exciting new terms are coming out in that way, which is, I think, really interesting.
I did encounter a gay slang like that 20 years ago in the Philippines. It was extraordinary. Yeah.
Great.
Okay. So Leuli and I have just come back from a conference in Auckland where there was a wonderful presentation by a Maori academic, Belinda Burrell, on whiteness as a silent space, which we find it difficult to define because it is the space in which many of us exist in. It's not seen as a mode of being. Masculinity is often equally ambiguous and silent. It's often made present by what it is not. So you're interested in the work of Richard Bell, Ming Wong and Yuki Kahara, and I'm wondering if you may be able to talk a little bit about how masculinity or its other are staged in these works.
Well, before we get
you want to
Richard
stay with this
Bell,
one?
It was more Richard I was thinking of, in that I don't think his work's ever been discussed in terms of masculinity. Everybody goes to Aboriginality or his politics, that's usually what's uppermost in discussions. But this particular work, Larry, where he's pretending to be, I'm hoping most of you have seen it, he's pretending to be a powerful art world figure who's snorting cocaine and, as you can see here, peeing into the canal at Venice. Is so strongly, and also he has the sort of the young female, I guess, lover.
Distraction.
Trophy. Really. So it's very much masculinity as a powerful trophy. He's able to have a trophy wife. He's able to, have power. He wields it in this quite hilarious way. And it's just so interesting to have a kind of art world power mocked so successfully. The other film is also very humorous, but it's, I'm trying to think, what's the other one called? The one with the...
I forget, but I'll look it up.
It's where he... Google it. You're so good with Wikipedia. With... where he becomes the Grim Reaper. But this one, that one seems less interested or less concerned with masculinity, whereas this one is very much about powerful white masculinity, which then gets shifted by dint of him playing this character. Although it's quite an accurate, although exaggerated critique of the art world. He says, I'm going to raise what does he say? I'm going to raise the prices. I'll do it like that. You wait. I'll take these artists and make them, big stars. So it is. I assume it's a spoof on
Larry Gagosian.
I don't know whether Gagosian is really in any way like this figure, but it's just an incredibly interesting parody of a certain type of masculinity, which I don't really think... I mean, you think of who else has mocked power in the art world in that way. There was that artist that... Tovi Ben, the one that did the takeoff of Rick Victoria and somebody else. It was a video where this person was sort of mocking art critics, us, and artists. But there aren't that many works really that go so deeply to the heart of both the art world, power and masculinity in quite such a strong way as this work does.
Do you feel like it's his critique of art institutions, like art prizes with his earlier work and this work in this exhibition context, do you think that it's part of like male privilege being able to do that, have that kind of critique? I'm thinking particularly about his work from a few years ago, I think it's The Dinner Party, where Gary Foley becomes president of Australia as a republic with the Aboriginal land rights flag as the national flag, and this kind of like aspirational future, but with like kind of a recentering with First Nations cultures at the centre. And that perhaps for a woman Aboriginal artist, like I mean, I can't say what perhaps, but that the concerns are different, and for women, the majority of the art world, producers, curators, artists, writers, it's still like a struggle to get space to, you know.
Well, I guess it's entirely, you're absolutely right, it's entirely continuous with his institutional critique, and I guess if one were to be then take the critique of masculinity out, one might be critical of some of the ways he uses young blonde women, for example. So there's a sort of a, you know, you could make all sorts of readings once you read him through that lens, both with him in terms of perhaps a funny institutional critique, and then occasionally, more critical of his privilege relative to, you know, young women, or, you know, how he might sit relative to women artists, for example.
The title of the other work, which is the blowing up the gallery spoof, is Charlie's Angels.
Okay.
I think humour plays such a big role in his work and in many Aboriginal artists' coping strategies within a volatile settler colonial context. So, you know, this kind of bringing in the American comic language, it's really profound.
It's a pretty funny choice of images.
Yeah, the sort of the deliberate crudity of peeing in the canal. It's interesting. Yeah, I'd be intrigued to see someone write about his work in terms of masculinity across those
platforms. And the use of parody, so you also drag.
This is such a hilarious work with the, I guess what we've got, Priscilla, Queen of the Desert, Picnic at Hanging Rock, and what's the one on that? That's that. Is it Siren?
It's the Siren. Isn't that the River Bunny painting? Or no, perhaps not with Ming Wong, but anyway.
And and there was a live performance as well as part of the APT conference. I guess that idea of parodying what are to us classic Australian films was also part of it. It's a slipperier in terms of gender, I thought, this work. Harder to, given the kind of, the wigs are just so, it sort of reminded me of Paul Capsis, who also doesn't, to sort of imitate a woman but not imitate a woman. It's sort of interestingly sitting between, it's drag and not drag.
Yeah, and then kind of the overwhelming costuming is kind of really interesting, where, at least to my knowledge, 2 of the performers are trans and identify as trans. So there's this like hyper performance, the hyper reality through popular culture in terms of like RuPaul's Drag Race and all these kinds of queer shows, and this ultra performance and bringing in glitter and all of this kind of stuff that then is this kind of universal queer aesthetic that comes through in all of these landscapes.
But relative to the RuPaul, they would be sort of, low down the scale. There's a sort of a clunky...
They'd get through the second week.
Yeah, they get through the second week. So there's an amateurism to it that... And I think when they were talking at the APT, it was like only one is actually a dancer, the one in blue.
The one in blue.
And the other 3 were talking about how inept they were and how they'd basically... their dance skills had been sort of produced during the making of the work itself. So hence it has that clunky, and obviously relative to RuPaul, really clunky. Yeah. So it's sort of an interestingly ragged version of drag. It's hard to place anywhere, and it's interesting you say that 2 are trans, which didn't come through at all.
I particularly enjoy Shaman's beard in this context. But the other thing that I enjoyed, and I commented on it to one of the performances, I loved the choice of shoes. Because
they're completely daggy.
Because they're very sort of they don't
almost
fit.
Dunlops.
I think desert boots.
Yeah, they're like desert boots, and they don't fit at all with the rest of the costume. So there's this one detail, apart from Shaman's beard, which completely undercuts the whole thing. And apparently there had been a conversation about the shoe, like the footwear, and I thought, no, this was perfect, because I think it would have been, they wouldn't have been able to manage this terrain in high heels, that's for a start. So it's quite practical.
Priscilla barely could.
Priscilla was an expert.
In terms of OH&S, it would have been a
disaster. It's just there's a number of these details which undercut those conventions and show that they're also being played with, deliberately,
Which I think is a real contrast to the extremely precise poise and the silence in Yuki's performance work.
And also Justin and Benji.
And Justin and Benji's work as well.
And Siren, whose name, the Korean artist, who does that wonderful DVD of the women playing male roles, which was a classic of Korean performance. Is fantastic. They're all perfect, those other forms.
It's interesting with the Yuki work that there's a Carrie Mae Weems that's also got that same Victorian costume shown from behind. And there's also...
It's also really present in the work of Aboriginal artist Ria. And I guess, it's a Victorian morning dress, so it's from that period, late 19th century, early 20th century. And it's like a symbolic, particularly that she's in black, so she's in mourning, but what is she mourning? If you've ever been to Samoa, it's like 35 degrees all the time, high humidity. This is completely impractical clothing, and yet majority of the population have taken on like a version of the Mother Hubbard, and lots of kind of really clunky clothing. Even our like formal men's lava lava is like in satin, and so it's really, or nylon, and like really sweaty and not so good. But I think it's there's that kind of like lament in the body, that she's like perhaps looking at what she is allowed to be, what she's able to be.
There's also a fairly strong kind of pushing back, and I remember Yuki talking particularly about this series and about the act of turning your back, which culturally is one that's quite offensive, and then also in the performance, the Siva in motion, the Siva that she's doing is a dance that's performed by high-ranking women.
Yes.
So she's.
And it's in that style of the stop-motion photography from around the same period. This is the Tawalunga, and it's the most high ceremonial dance in Samoan, and also a version of it in Tongan cultures. And so it's also kind of just trying to echo the movements of the waves that came and devastated the southern part of one of the main islands, Upolu in Samoa, and then also the north of Tonga. So there's kind of, I think, if you don't understand the register of Samoan dance, then you won't necessarily read that. And it's just like really beautiful silent movements. But there's that kind of melancholy that comes through that movement for an initiated viewer as well.
Both works, in fact, have that melancholy, don't they? Just in tone. I'm not quite sure what's conveying it, but I mean, in terms of the stop motion.
I think with if we could,
Angela's
Angela's work.
Sorry.
Angela is there's like two strands in her practice. She's looking at the place of the individual and the body, and she worked for a long time as a TV presenter, model, and so she brings that kind of critique. And then she also looks in some of her other work in the show at the commodification of labor, kind of more how labor is constantly being moved offshore, even from China to somewhere else in China.
That work is wonderful.
Yeah,
it's called
edging and seaming.
Edging and seaming. So on one screen you get her mother, and the garage door is up, so she's doing piecework, but she's doing the last piecework in Auckland before the jobs are offshored to Chinese women.
Which has this cyclical movement where in Angela's family there's Chinese heritage, in my family there's Chinese heritage. A lot of Samoans are mixed with Chinese heritage from the first wave in the same Victorian era, so it kind of is almost moving back to the relations in China.
It wasn't until I came back to the gallery today and did another tour through the galleries and saw edging and seaming and looked at it properly that I thought how wonderful the dialogue was, because Angela's work is about the body. Well, she has a spectacular body, but she's interested in labour, bodies and labour, the labour of women, including her own mother. And I think it's wonderful work.
In fact, probably just to mention that this is almost like the accompaniment to the work that Yuki has made, where it's like the uncovering of the body, and this has been really, really controversial for the global Samoan community. So a whole lot of kind of hate mail that she's received.
Angela,
because there are double standards on the men's tattoo being shown in public, and that's kind of acceptable, and the women's tattoo being shown in public is unacceptable. And so there's a kind of the critique within this, and some of her other work where she's kind of standing on her heels, which is also an echoing of the Tawalunga dance, kind of saying, well, why do our bodies have to be covered up? It's too hot, or all of these kind of practical reasons. But also, if we are getting towards a more equal society and reclaiming a more symbiotic relationship between genders and people within a society, rather than just keeping going with patriarchy, then where does it stand? And she gets exhausted and her feet fall, and then she keeps trying to go back up. So it's like this constant work.
Okay, that's very fascinating.
And Yuki was just recently on the response to her new show in Auckland. A study of the Samoan savage was also received hate mail and threats of her being exiled from Samoa, and so it's they're dealing with quite raw issues and.
Yeah.
I just was thinking that the public availability of the Samoan male body with tattoo is such that you can walk around at the Pacifica Festival and watch it being done.
Yeah.
You stand on the rope and you watch someone which is an astonishing thing to see.
Yeah. At the PAA, Pacific Arts Association symposium that Ruth and I were at, there was a live tattooing of a woman's tattoo, the malu.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
That's the process of undergoing it isn't what's taboo, it's the display afterwards.
Oh, right, okay.
So once it's been finished, everyone will get coconut oil and put it on, and then everyone's like kind of celebrating that they've gone through this process and they're entering a different stage in their life. And so anytime there's like a family occasion, men will come out and lift up their lava a bit to show their thighs, and they'll dance, and that's like totally acceptable. But for women, it's like this total double standard, strange. Some of us think it's maybe from the colonization period, and then from German and British missionaries and colonial agents. But no matter what, today it's like a Samoan patriarchal attitude that we're trying to oppose, resist.
Julie, did you want to talk a little bit more about Siren, or?
No. I think just very quickly, Siren, the wonderful work upstairs in the gallery on that side, I'll say 3 point, can I remember the numbers
3.3.
anymore? 3.3, 3.4.
Yeah.
Oh,
Very,
well done.
very, very fascinating, because it's apparently a practice that's died out, but it's extremely rigorous, and you can see an older woman training a younger woman, and an astonishing, in contradistinction to a tradition in England, at any rate, in the past, where men played women's roles, but here women are playing men's roles. And so a very, very nice kind of exchange with other manifestations throughout APT, and I thought a very thoughtful and interesting inclusion. Not a theatrical practice, needless to say, that I had known anything about before seeing the work in the show. And just one of the many ways in which people's interest in playing with gender or with personal location is so extremely fluid throughout human societies, and one of the great things about this APT is that it reminds us of that, you know, that people are very different, and that also that there are fluidities in terms of how one assigns a position to oneself and how others assign it to oneself.
I guess that comes up in the STAB archive as well. That you know, that historical.
And the STAB archive speaks, I think, a little tiny bit to the Blue Blouse
Yes.
work of Silvana Mangano and Gabriella Mangano.
Where is it there? Yeah, I guess so. One of my last question really for you all was, there's a strong thread throughout APT of artists seeking to create spaces for alternative modes of being, and the body and its articulation seems to be at the crux of many. And you know, are there other artists that you would like to explore in that context? Maybe you can start.
The answer would be lots, but
Yeah,
perhaps
lots.
we wonder whether we shouldn't.
What's our time?
Nearly 20 past.
Okay. So you want to open up?
Yeah.
Okay. Questions then? Does anybody have any questions for our panel?
Francis has one.
I'm so glad you did talk about Siren, because... Oh, I don't think I need it, do I?
Yes, you do.
I do. Not going backwards. All right. I'm so glad, Julie, that you did talk about Siren, because it's my favourite piece. And it is because, although there is the possibility of gender fluidity, though I think within the acting, it's a very specific acting, it isn't necessarily within the psyche, as most of the others are.
Yeah.
There is also a stillness about it, and I'm wondering whether you think that it is because it is the work where it is not within the psyche. It is not argued to be the identity of the performers, but their performance that is happening. So those are not women who are in any way trans.
No.
They are not transvestite even, apart from that moment. So how does that distinction, you think, play out?
I'm damned if I know. And why historically, not knowing anything about Korean culture, why historically that became a practice at that time, I have no idea. But what you're saying is very interesting, because, of course, performing as somebody is very different from wanting to be somebody different, and it's worthwhile remembering that in the context of all of the different works that run throughout the show, which is to say, works that are about performativity. Yeah. It's not an answer.
Hi, just going back to the Samoa and the tattoos and the gender divide and the patriarchal attitudes, just because you said there were 4 gender groups in Samoa, so how does the performing or showing or revealing of the tattoos then play out with the transgender communities? Because surely they must have some tattoos or not. Can you just talk that through a bit more?
I've spoken a lot with Yuki about who amongst the Whawhawhine community is tattooed, and it's kind of it's also a pretty controversial act for tufunga tatatau, master tattooist, to go with your desired gender. So I'm not sure if there are Whawhawhine who identify as women who have the women's tattoo. That's like not really a full answer, but it's pretty.
So the tattooists wouldn't.
Sometimes.
Right?
There's a lot of, so like Samoa, as an archipelago, has about 300,000 people. A third of it is an American territory with no citizenship rights, and 2/3 is an independent country, and which was colonized by the Germans, then by New Zealand, and independent since 1962. And then there's about 700,000 Samoans living around the world. So there's constantly like flows backwards and forwards, but the kind of overarching, I would say, conservative attitudes stem from that colonial period and from the kind of indoctrination into particular modes of what is acceptable, what isn't acceptable. Also, the term Whawhawhine isn't exactly a translation of transgender, and the way that transgender communities organize themselves in the Australian context isn't the same as the way that they organize in Samoa. The Prime Minister is the patron of the Samoan Whawhawhine Association. And there's a visibility, there's an acceptance that's completely different, because Whawhawhine have existed since the beginning of time, and I've always been part of communities. I was taught to dance first by a Whawhawhine member of our family. So it's a very different kind of place. But then it's not all like rosy either. To actually fall in love is like a really rare kind of thing to have a strong relationship. You can listen to Yuki and some trans activists or Whawhawhine activists. Even I kind of get lost in language. Speaking on a panel called Whawhawhine Towards Decolonization that was held at the Art Gallery, New South Wales last year in June, and bringing out all sorts of issues in a way that we can talk about here that we can't talk about in Samoa. So it's like there's safety in being in the diaspora.
Other questions?
This one over here. It's Rosemary.
I really like that last point you make, and I guess drawing on a conversation I had with Ruth a while ago about this context, these two buildings, and the way that the work has been positioned and curated. And just, I guess those sensitivities I completely went past. I didn't realise that in a different context that would be incredibly contentious. So just with that kind of, maybe, I'm not sure if this is the right word, but normalising effect, I guess, what is the life after of that? I mean,
Of the artworks?
Yeah, I guess how they've been interpreted in this context, and then how they play out in another context thereafter. I just want to know of that, the power of, I guess, this context, if there is one. I think there's certainly an influence, and whether that then lasts for the artist or their work.
I think Angela has a survey of her video work currently called Whaalinga at Mangere Art Centre, Ngā Tohu o Wenuku, in southern Auckland, in the area which is like 85% islanders. And so a lot of their programming reflects that, but also they're also trying to push boundaries. And so she has some of her work in APT in that survey. And it's known as a contemporary art space, so people come in with kind of different attitudes, and there are like 5 churches surrounding that art centre, so there's kind of this constant interplay, and sometimes the pastor wants to come and ban a work from being shown, and sometimes they are fine with things. So it's constantly like negotiating case by case. Yuki recently staged a salon of her work at Art Gallery in Apia in Samoa, so she's kind of at the forefront of taking work home to make sure that the audiences in the homeland are aware of what's happening and maybe becoming an audience for art, because I think for the kind of audience that we are privileged to have in Australia. You need middle class. You need people who are not just concentrating on survival, economic and otherwise. So, yeah.
I guess I'm also interested in Ruth's response to that question and how the work was displayed in over the last 3 months, different works, I guess, with dealing with those same issues, and whether, I guess, is there anything lost in that process as well? I guess you're talking about things that I guess gained, but whether, like me, having viewed that work and not understanding that sort of sensitivities.
So when you say lost, do you think you mean in terms of like a translation of the context from which it's come? I think there are in some cases things that are lost, and I think that's one of the reasons why, particularly in this APT, in the Pacific representation, I tried very much to look at the way that performance was enacted within the region in a very broad way, and for there to be many moments where you could engage in very different ways, so that you because the performance has always been part of APT, and particularly Pacific performance, but it's in many cases been a spectacle at the opening. So this APT was an opportunity to have a number of projects and artists involved that really did flesh out and give our audiences a much more nuanced idea of what performance was about. But there's always things that don't translate, and I think, the artists understand that as well.
I'm just going to say, it reminds me of that song, "Something's Lost but Something's Gained."
Yes, it can be something different.
So what you had to say about the repression or the covering, that makes a nonsense of one major newspaper critic's response to Angela Tiatia's work. But unless you know that, my view about beautiful women using their bodies for performance work is how fabulous to have that opportunity. And if that's what your material is, then you use it in various ways. I've thought that for a long, long time. But inevitably, you can't have every possible reading in the one context. It's going to change, and I think the loss and the gain is one of the things that makes showing work in different contexts so valuable.
But I think in relation to Angela's work, what's interesting is that is her medium, and she is using that body, but it's an endurance piece, and it's about what it takes to actually continue to hold that pose. What that impacts on her as a person.
Yes.
I think she's an incredibly strong artist.
I'll just make the completely banal point that it would be no point doing it if you were not beautiful.
Yeah.
Which is fine.
I'd say too that
it'll be a different
challenge,
work anyway.
Like I guess also with works like this by any kind of global or local Indigenous body, is the mistranslation into majority European Australian diaspora's art history and our collective lack of knowledge of different art histories. And so then, this is a brown body, cool, what's that? But then that kind of reading around the malu is something that can come through in a text, but is also maybe not for a broader societal audience either. It's for an initiated audience from that community. Okay. And that's something that David Garneau, who's a Métis artist and curator in Canada, talks about, where in terms of sovereign display territories, where works are made for an Indigenous audience first. And I'm not saying that's in the case of Angela. She really wants to be kind of seen as a contemporary artist from Australia and Aotearoa and the islands, and she's doing things around endurance, around the body and femininity. So in a sense, her Samoan indigeneity comes second. But it's literally embodied in her body. So, yeah.
But it is an interesting instance, though, of one that does become, in the Australian context, it was only when I heard that it was controversial elsewhere that, because you read it much more, in this context it read as about endurance and labour rather than a challenge to a system of display, which, it doesn't come through as, I don't know how you would do I guess it would be a different work if she probably has put the stress on the endurance and the labour rather than the...
She does talk about, there is an interview with Ange up on the third floor where she does talk about those issues, but unfortunately it's not linked.
Except for the wonderful thing that she's upside down. Right?
Yeah.
She's
right?
So that gives you a clue from the very beginning that something's
been inverted. Yeah.
Ah, good point. Formal analysis comes to the rescue.
It's
no, it's true.
But you might not know what it is.
Yeah.
I mean, of course, the thing that is so astonishing are those extremely enviable tattoos.
And the legs.
And
I guess
enviable
and the
legs.
hides.
The presence of her malu and her body is like, for Samoan or other kind of islander audiences, that reading comes in alongside the reading around endurance.
Sure.
But every time that she's in the work. So it's not just because it's this one, it's from 5 years ago. It's when she's standing in another work at Circular Quay in Sydney, and she's just standing and it's an endurance, and she's wearing a similar black bodysuit, and the kind of taunts that she gets and people whistling and all this other stuff, which is basically just around a body which is female in public space, and the kind of assault of these like men who think they can say terrible things. So, yeah, I think it's always...
And it's interesting in one of her most recent works that she actually painted it over. So she make-upped over so you cannot tell that she has a malu.
I've seen that, but I can't remember where.
It was at...
it's in Campbell.
Oh, it's at Campbelltown.
It's called...
In video.
Yeah.
In Video X.
Yeah.
Video X video.
Any other questions?
Michelle's waving her hand.
Michelle's waving her mitt in the air.
I was just wondering, and I can't think of the name of the artist, but I'm sure Julie will, but speaking about endurance and labour, the artist who did the charcoal work, the performance.
Melati Suryadama.
If you could bring that into the conversation.
Oh. I don't know what to say. I mean, who saw Melati do her performance on the opening weekend? It's unforgettable and extraordinary thing to do, which is charcoal grinding. She did charcoal grinding for the best part of 12 hours, and she started in a white dress, and not only did it get dirtier, but she herself became sort of suffused with charcoal dust, and so did some of the air in the gallery, and it was the smell of it was astonishing. So it was what I thought of was that her labour in making that work was indistinguishable from the labour of people who do grind charcoal in Yogyakarta, and I imagine they grind charcoal for water purification, to put into bottles, and indeed as some fashionable folk do in Australia. I've seen charcoal in water, in Sydney in particular, to take stuff out of the water. So I don't know quite what to say. I mean, it was an extraordinary work for the gallery to sponsor, and it made a very particular contribution to the APT, but I can't think in any more sophisticated way about it, I don't think. Though perhaps Susan and Ruth and Leuli can.
The limits of our art histories.
Okay, I have a last little plug to make for the APT catalogue, which you can get in the gallery store, $39.95. a wonderful thing to have as the APT closes and you won't be able to have the luxury of coming back in and seeing all the wonderful works again. And then really just to thank our wonderful panellists today, Leuli, Sue and Julie. It's been wonderful having you here, and please give them all a round of applause.